Hello and welcome to everybody joining us live on TOC. We are back with the second round of interviews. Today we have the man himself, Dr. Paul Tambyah. But before we jump right into it, please remember to like, share and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're tuning in on YouTube, do hit that bell to be notified whenever we publish new videos, right? And then one final thing, we do have about 10-15 minutes at the end to ask Dr. Paul Tambyah some of your questions. So please do remember to go down to the comment section, leave some questions there, and we might be able to get to some of the comments or questions that you have. But without further ado, I know you're a very busy man, we should jump right into it. We have Chairman of the STP, Dr. Paul Tambyah. So, Dr. Paul, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about the man behind the candidate, the human being.
Well, first of all, I have to apologize, okay, because I didn't realize this was live. So I thought you were just recording it.
Yeah, no worries.
And so what I did was I double booked myself, which is my biggest problem. I'm trying to do too many things at the same time. So I just did an introductory address to a workshop that's being conducted by Singapore Medical Association Junior Doctors Committee. And that, I think, encapsulates what I actually do. I like my work as a physician, but I'm also an educator and I'm a researcher. And I've also actually gotten involved in advocacy. And they're all kind of tied down together because when I came back from the States, you know, I realized I couldn't settle down in the States because the healthcare system there is far more messed up than our healthcare system right now. It's got, you know, really high quality care, but 40 million people at that time, and that was before Obamacare, didn't have access to insurance. And so when I came back, I realized that things were not so bad, but at that time, HIV care, you know, there was no subsidies at all. And so I got involved with Action for AIDS. I learned about the civil society scene in Singapore. I got involved in Marua, and then eventually I drifted into politics.
Okay. So can you tell us maybe a little bit more about your research, your work in the medical sector, and what drives you, what inspired you to get into healthcare and medicine?
Well, my dad was a physician. He was an endocrinologist. He specialized in diabetes. And obviously he was a great role model, although he, you know, tried to discourage us from going into medicine. He told us how hard life was. And one of my earliest memories in childhood was on Christmas Day, when he was treating a patient who had a severe kidney infection. And in those days, there were no infectious disease specialists in Singapore. And basically, this patient needed to have his kidney taken out. And he couldn't find a surgeon who'd be willing to do it. So he had to sit by the patient's bedside, walk the patient, send the patient down to the ICU. And it was really miserable. And as a kid, you want your dad around on Christmas Day. But he sort of made us understand what had happened. And that kind of inspired me, you know, the idea that you could go into a field and actually make a difference in somebody's life in a very real way. Although I realized there are many other fields that you can do that. But one of the things I also realized early on in life was that where my skill sets and where my strengths and weaknesses were. And the first thing I've come to the clear understanding about is I'm terrible with my hands. So if anything goes wrong at home, what my wife used to do is she would call my father-in-law. But now he's 88 years old. And so we needed to do something with a bookcase. So I thought, okay, she's going to trust me with it. But no, she called her brother, okay, who's an engineer. And so, you know, it's, I said, that's fine, okay? Because she knows, like, if I try and fix something, it'll end up in a worse state than before. So anything to do with engineering, construction, architecture, or something that you do with your hands, even surgery, is not for me.
It's a very honest answer there. What got you then into politics, right? That's quite a shift there.
Yeah, it is. But on the other hand, this is something that we're realizing more and more, is that medicine there's a very famous pathologist, Rudolf Virchow, and he argued that politics is actually medicine written large. See, one of the things that we realized, in addition to doing infectious disease, I also do general medicine. It's kind of like our national service. We have to take care of the general patients. And you see these patients who come in again and again. And very often they're old people living alone with no one to look after them. So Singapore has this many helping hands approach to social services. So they have somebody who takes care of their utilities, there's somebody who takes care of their meals on wheels, there's somebody who takes them down to the activity center on certain days. But it's like 5 different agencies that they're dealing with. And invariably, they will fall through the cracks. One day they will fall, they will get a broken hip, they will get an infection, there's nobody to look after them. And so they come back to hospital, you know. And so you realize that you can end up treating the same person repeatedly, but unless you deal with the underlying social issues that brought the person to hospital in the first place, you know, you're just wasting your time. In fact, there's a very famous local book called The Art of Advocacy in Singapore. And what's interesting is at least 5 or 6 of the people who wrote chapters in that book tell the same story. And this is a story about advocates all over the world. And basically they say they find babies drowning in a river. So what they do is they pull the babies out of the river, and then they build shelters for them, they build nutrition things for them, and the different advocates keep doing that. They're pulling the babies out of the river. But nobody stops to ask, why are the babies in the river? Yeah, and then they realize that somebody is throwing the babies in the river. So they have to go upstream and find out what is the cause and start dealing with it. And this is the difference between welfare and advocacy. So welfare is you try and help the babies in the river. And being a good doctor is you help the patients who come to you. You treat their underlying problem. But to really deal with the problem, you have to go upstream and find out why they are there. You see, what is the social causes that lead to their getting into this condition? And this was made really apparent during the pandemic, where you see it was not equally, it did not equally affect everybody. This was recognized all over the world. And in Singapore, it was most apparent when you had these huge outbreaks in the migrant worker dormitories.
Yes.
You see, so people who are living crowded together, a room this size may have had 10 people living there. And if one of them gets a respiratory infection, there's no question about it. Within days, half of them will get it as well. So these are what they call the social determinants of health. And they have become more and more apparent as equally important, or perhaps even more important than just knowing the right drugs or vaccines or tests and treatment. And so that's how I ended up getting into politics.
I see. So that's so that I think explains very clearly how you got into politics. But then why the SDP? Why not the PAP? I heard through the grapevine that they tried to poach you at some point.
I don't think they tried very hard. I didn't quite fit the mold.
Yeah, but why the SDP? Why not the other opposition parties, and why not the incumbent?
Well, you know, the SDP has long had a very clearly stated ideological position. They are very much left of center. You know, they believe in human rights, freedom of expression. These are things which are important to me, as well as universal access to healthcare, education, and housing. So in a way, they were most aligned with my own personal values. And again, I forgot, the other point about going into politics is about 30 years ago, most memorably, at that time, Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong, he told Catherine Lim, you know, if you really want to make a difference in Singapore, you've got to go into politics. You can't just sit on the sidelines and write critical commentaries. And I think he made sense, you see, that you really have to kind of go into the arena rather than, you know, like everybody else, just sit around and grumble in a coffee shop.
So, have you ever faced pushback or pressure for your work in politics, right? Especially as an opposition politician. Have there been any difficulties or sacrifices that you've had to make?
Well, actually, no. In general, I have not faced. I have not faced a lot of pushback, or and that's partly because of the fact that I was relatively successful already when I got involved in politics. So in a way, you know, I was relatively high profile, and so it would have been a little bit awkward to try and take me down. I'll give you an illustration of this. There's someone who's far more famous than I am. So you know, I did my postgraduate training at the University of Wisconsin, and one of the most memorable experiences I had there was attending a lecture by Wang Tan, and he was one of the Tiananmen protesters. And so he was finally released from jail. This was in the mid-1990s, about 7 years after being kept in prison after Tiananmen. And so they asked him, they said, were you well treated? He said, yes, I was well treated, but that's because I was a bird in a gilded cage. Because he was so high profile, he knew that if anything happened to him, the international media would come crashing down. So he's obviously more famous than I am. The other interesting thing I remember that he said, though, was that one of the American students asked him, so what can we do to help you? And he said, nothing. He said, the minute you try and help, it'll be foreign interference. And that sounds really familiar, but you can tell where it came from. But he says, you do your own thing in your own country. And he says, the Chinese civil society, he said it's been squashed, but it will come back. And that was very inspiring to me. So I've been relatively protected, but at the same time, there are these OB markers. And so there have been a couple of incidents in the last 3 or 4 years when I've got this phone call, and then one of my bosses will say, hey, somebody called me up, and I know exactly who it is, and they're not happy with this. And so and this was about several years ago, and it was quite funny. They asked me to take down a Facebook post. And this was after I attended a May Day event, and I gave a talk. And apparently one of the ministers was not happy about it because I talked about a certain comment that had been made by a senior official, and I didn't name the official. But it was quite funny because after I made that comment, 3 or 4 junior doctors named the official. So they wanted me to take it down, and I said, look, if I take it down, so I did take it down, and then they wanted to make a comment. So I made a comment, and I said, I took it down, and I said it's the job of a patriot, I said, to agree with the government when they're right, and to disagree with the government when they're wrong. And I cleared this with my sort of immediate boss, and he said it was okay. Then 2 hours later, he calls me up. He says, can you amend that, take out that paragraph? I said, look, it's already gone out, and it's gone kind of viral. And I said, if I take it down, it'll be obvious that you got a phone call. Then he said, okay, heck, forget it. So it's quite interesting how these things get negotiated in Singapore. I see. Is that there are the OB markers, and I think, I can't remember who it was who talked about, in Singapore they have the white list, the grey list, and the black list. So the blacklist is like PJ Tham, Jolavan Wam, and people like that. Maybe Terry Shi, But the grey list, maybe people like myself and Leon, and, who are kind of tolerated as long as we, are perceived as being reasonable in quotes.
So that's the sort of sweet spot to be in. But maybe speaking about black and grey lists, right?
Right.
It wasn't too long ago, I think, that, there was a perception that the SDP was the Chisun Juan party. Right. And of course, now I think that's changed quite a bit. There are very, very strong candidates like yourself coming into the fray, coming into the SDP.
Right.
And you were elected SDP chairman back in 2017. So could you tell us a bit more about your role, the SDP's long-term strategy, their succession plans, and maybe if there are any sort of 5 or 10-year plans that the SDP has going beyond this election cycle?
Okay, first of all, the role of the chairman actually is to sign the checks. And nowadays it's done electronically because every political party in Singapore has the same kind of constitution. And interestingly enough, it's a Leninist constitution. Okay. And that's because the PAP was primarily a Leninist party. So I had dinner with a colleague who's around my age, a bit younger, and he grew up in Poland under communism. And he was really surprised to hear that every political party in Singapore has a central committee, which is led by a general secretary, and they have cadre members. He said, don't tell me you have a Politburo. I said, no, we don't have a Politburo, but we have everything else.
PJ is probably at home, shaking his fist in joy.
Sure. Yes. So that's the role of a chairman, is to handle the administrative, the banking and the finance issues. And that dates back to Lee Kuan Yew's memories of what happened to the Malayan Communist Party, when the Secretary General ran away with all the money at the beginning, and that was the beginning of the end of them. But so that's my role in the Singapore Democratic Party. Now you asked the question about succession planning, and this really it sets off a bell in me, because to my mind, succession planning is something that's done in family businesses. You see, and I know many political parties in Asia, especially in the Philippines, are essentially family businesses. But the Singapore Democratic Party is by no means a family business. I just met Sun Juan's daughters, and none of them has any aptitude or interest in taking over the party, thank God. And I'm sure he's saying that too. But as a Democratic Party, see, our idea is that somebody will bubble up and will come in and take over. And so, there's no anointed successor. And that's what happens in the Democratic parties in major high-income countries, is that eventually somebody will come up. Nobody could have imagined that, Barack Obama would succeed Bill Clinton and Al Gore, and lead the Democratic Party. I mean, he came up as a state senator, and then he became a senator, and next thing you know, he's president. So that's what happens in democratic societies. And hopefully, if we win a town council or two, then a lot of volunteers will come forward. We'll have some resources. We'll be able to try out people and their skills in terms of the town halls that we organize, in terms of the management of people and activities in the various towns. And then I'm sure somebody will come up.
Okay,
Yeah.
so stick to the principles.
Exactly.
Get strong.
It's going to work.
People
I mean,
will-
it's worked all over the world. There's no reason why it can't work.
Love it. All right. So what have you and the STP been doing for the last 5 years in the run-up, in the lead-up to the preparation for this election?
Yeah, so we have been walking the ground. I have been walking the ground in Bukit Panjang. We've been doing house visits. We've been doing, we do all the festivals. We actually have people actually write into us for municipal issues. Just on, was it Monday or Tuesday, we went on a house visit here, and the lady said, you're the ones who helped us when we had a fire. And I had completely forgotten about it. This is 4 years ago. They had a fire in a flat, and then, they were having trouble moving. So we put out a call for boxes, and a whole lot of volunteers came and brought boxes, and we helped them as they packed up their stuff and moved. So we've been doing that at Bukit Panjang. Dr. Chi has been doing that at Bukit Batok, and the Sembawang and Marsiling UT teams have been doing it as well. And then, of course, Bukit Batok got taken away, and SMC disappeared.
All right. So you've run twice now, right? What
Right.
have you learned from past campaigns? And perhaps, is there anything new or different that you're doing this time around?
Well, I've learned a huge amount, in particular in dealing with the mainstream media. Is that you really have to think twice or three times before you make a statement to the mainstream media, because it gets amplified very quickly. I like you guys, but they have a reach that's far wider than yours.
Oh yeah, no contest.
No contest whatsoever. And I still remember I think it was 2015, I made a joke on at a rally about DPM Tharman, and the next thing you know, I'm getting whacked by everybody in the PAP, and this in a short election cycle, it takes 2 to 3 days to undo the so-called damage that's done by what you think is a flippant remark that suddenly gets taken seriously, and it just cascades out of control, and it takes away really valuable time that you should be spending talking about your policies, talking about what you're going to do for the town, and just essentially meeting residents and doing real campaigning. So I've learned that. So I'm trying really, really careful to avoid being flippant, and to say essentially things that are very clear and focused.
So, I mean, speaking of which, you're up for a rematch now with Liang
Right.
Eng-hua, right? How optimistic of your chances are you? What's
Well-
the sort of mindset that you have, vis-a-vis your chances of winning going into this
Yeah,
election?
frankly, everybody says that, you're in the same constituency, you only have a little bit more to go. But this morning we were there in the constituency distributing flyers, and just ahead of us was this lady distributing the PAP flyer. And we have a little 2-sheet piece that we put at the door. They had a plastic bag with a ziplock, and then they had this 20-page or was it 15-page color brochure, detailing how the MRT had come to Bukit Panjang, and they had the little card with the polling, the vote for PAP kind of thing. So it's really an uphill battle, and it's not just the resources that they have for a regular campaign. I don't know if you know this, but Mr. Liang actually has a $1 meal campaign. And in fact, we talk to all these people and they say, we're happy to support you, but Mr. Liang gave us a tray of eggs for $1. And so that but is what really is the reality check. So within the bubble, people who I know, people who are friendly, people who support us, everybody says, time for you to get into parliament. But once you step outside the bubble, then you see the things that really matter to people. And $1 for a tray of eggs really does make a difference. And to his credit, though, he didn't start this just before the election. He had it running from, I think it was March 2024. So it's been going for a while.
Okay. So what is your, I guess, broad town council plan for Bukit Panjang?
Yeah, so we have a town council plan. It's actually available on our website. We haven't updated the executive summary because it's pretty much the same. And basically, we're going to run the town council ourselves. We're not going to depend on a managing agent. And we've learned the experience from the Workers' Party that when you put out a tender for a managing agent, nobody applies. You know, that's essentially what happened for them.
Do you have the manpower and the resources?
We do. And you know, a town council collects all the service and conservancy charges. So if you do it direct without a managing agent, you actually do have the resources. And you look at the way the SDP runs rallies, food distributions, you know, we're, I think, the only party that's running a rally every night. And the logistics of running a rally are incredible. You know, in Singapore, just this morning, the Singapore Police Force is calling us. It's 8:45. You're supposed to take down the generator and the toilet at 9 o'clock. You've got 15 minutes to do it. 8:55 he calls up. The generator is gone, but the toilet is still there. You know? And we are calling the contractor. The contractor says, look, you know, my workers have been there since what time? And so, but we do it. You know, we've been able to do that. And this is the so-called SDP machinery. So these are people who can pull off that kind of event with that kind of complexity. So I'm pretty confident that we can. And even more than that, we actually have people who were in the last SDP town council. These are the old guys. Okay, they are kind of, you know, typical old guy. They have their own way of doing things, but they have the experience. See, and they were in the Bukit Gombak and Nisun South town councils in up to 1997, when the SDP ran the town councils, and they ran them pretty well. So I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to run a good town council.
That's great. Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of how you've amassed these sort of resources? I'm sure you have a very strong volunteer pool, right? Can you tell us more about the strengths and the resources that the SDP has?
Yeah, so I have nothing to do with amassing the resources because they've been built up over the years, from the days way back of Mr. Chiam and then Ling Hao Dung and the others who were involved in the SDP way back 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. So there is this SDP brand. And parts of the SDP brand are very attractive to people. You know, the idea of the never say die attitude. You know, the fact that we keep persisting, that we take on the difficult things. You know, we do innovative things. Like we were the first people to do a party political podcast more than 20 years ago. Then it got banned. Then we were the first people to do a humorous campaign video, and that got banned. You know, so I mean, but we don't care. You see, we kind of know that these things are going to happen, but we just push the envelope anyway, because you know, otherwise how does Singapore progress? So you've been a key contributor to the SDPs manifesto, to their party platform, to their proposals, right? Can you tell us what role did you play in shaping the manifesto? And also, are they cost tested? Right.
How do you put together the research and the brains for this manifesto?
So we have a very good team that's part of the PAP, what am I saying? The SDP policy team. Yeah, it's comparable to the PAP policy team, I would think, but better still, it's not constrained by the same kind of ideological straitjacket that we believe the PAP policy team is constrained by. So there are a number of individuals, and we also have a couple of young people who help us setting up the Google Docs. So I'll say, okay, this is the version, can you create a Google Doc? And then they tidy it up. And I'll be very honest, we use ChatGPT and DeepSeek.
Okay.
So and it's really good. You know, I did a post on my political Facebook page where I asked both ChatGPT and DeepSeek which were the SDP policies which had eventually been adopted by the PAP, and what was the time lag. And it was pretty impressive. They came up with a very detailed analysis of which were the policies, specific policies that we had proposed, and when the PAP had adopted them. And you should look it up. It's on my Facebook from a few months ago. And so we asked the ChatGPT to cost the education plan as a start. And they worked it out at about $1 billion, because that included the additional teacher salaries, the reduction in class sizes, But that actually is well within the projected budget surplus. See, even if you follow the other policy that we had, which was to reduce the GST from 9% to 7%, bear in mind that we have a forecasted budget surplus of $6.4 billion this year. So that cuts out about $4 billion. You're still left with about $1.8 to $2 billion in the surplus. If you take $1 billion off that, and then that brings down your, that funds the education plan. Now the healthcare plan is really interesting because it works out to be cost neutral. Because we eliminate the administrative and development charges, and so that is a huge chunk of healthcare costs in Singapore and in countries with similar healthcare systems, like in the United States. And so essentially by cutting out that component, you actually free up the funds to be used for basically for actual healthcare itself, in terms of reimbursement of the healthcare providers, and you don't have to build duplicates of very costly facilities. There's this thing called proton beam therapy, you know, and just because somebody gets it, everybody else wants to get it, and it's super expensive. You have to build a special building for it. So, you know, an island as small as Singapore with a population of only like 6 million, you don't really need so many of this kind of facilities if people are willing to collaborate with each other. And so that's one of the fundamental aspects of our healthcare plan, is the collaboration, breaking down the barriers between public and private sector. You know, we have senior leaders who whenever somebody leaves the public hospital and goes to the private sector, they say, oh, he's gone over to the dark side, you know, and that really shouldn't be the case. You know, we have a real shortage of junior doctors. They are really stressed out, and they are so overworked. Yet at the same time, between 40 and 50% of GPs are doing Botox. You know, and why are they doing Botox? Because it pays well and they've got nothing else to do. So there's clearly a mismatch. See, it's not a shortage, but rather a mismatch and a misallocation. And a lot of that is ideological and political. And it can be overcome if you have the political willpower to do something about it.
Well, this is the advantage of having a healthcare expert, right?
Yeah.
So perhaps, you know, we were just talking about healthcare. What are some of the key reforms that you'd like to see or that you would like to push for in Singapore?
Well, obviously healthcare was the first. You know, we came up with our healthcare plan way back around the 2011 general election, and we released it in 2012. It was a very detailed healthcare plan, and it wasn't just me. It was there were primarily general practitioners, but there was also a surgeon, there was an anesthetist, and there was a health economist on our panel. And it got some coverage from the media. In fact, I actually got a chance to debate it with Dr. Lam Pin Min at the university, thanks to Professor Tommy Cole. So that's the first one, you know, is to try and make healthcare universal and accessible to everyone, truly universal. You know, in other words, that you don't have to worry about busting your cap for the insurance and things like that. Second one is education, which we've kind of talked about briefly. And education should also be universal. Right now, there's a huge disparity right now between the quality of education that you get in some of the elite schools versus the so-called neighborhood schools.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. And this starts right at the beginning. You know, you look at so one of the main things that we've been talking about, and I've actually asked the education minister about this at a public forum, is why don't we nationalize the preschools? Because, you know, one of the great achievements of the early PAP in the 1960s was nationalization of primary schools. Because before the PAP came in, we had all kinds of private schools and clan schools and language schools and religious schools, and they decided to nationalize the schools. They allowed the schools to maintain their character. You know, the 100-year-old schools, they still maintain their character, but they're controlled by the government. So the curriculum is standard, the fees, the teacher salaries are standard. Of course, when they introduced independent schools, that kind of lost some of its standardization. But right now, there's a huge difference between somebody who goes to an elite preschool versus somebody who goes to a neighborhood preschool. Now, a couple of years ago, I was interviewing students together with a certain individual who is actually very active in the PAP grassroots. He's Vivian Balakrishnan's right-hand man. And for some reason, the two of us were in the same interview panel. And we were interviewing medical students. And I always ask them, you know, what do you do after your A-levels? And most of them say, oh, I worked as a receptionist in a clinic, or the guys, they had to go to NS, of course. And then some of the girls now, they like to work as baristas, or they give tuition. But one of the girls said, oh, I worked in a childcare center. And I said, oh, that's surprising. So I said, what was the most memorable thing that you had in the childcare center? And she said, it was these kids, and she worked in a neighborhood childcare center. These kids were asking whether they could take some food home for their siblings. And she said, I was shocked. I couldn't believe that there were people in Singapore who actually felt that their siblings were hungry. And so I asked her, I said, what percentage of Singaporeans do you think are food insecure? And she said, oh, maybe 5%. I said, well, it's probably closer to 10%. And then Vivian Balakrishna's psychic says, actually, it's probably closer to 15%. I said, that's really crazy. That's totally invisible. But I went back and looked it up. And there is some research on food insecurity in Singapore. And it is indeed probably about 10 to 15% of individuals in Singapore who are actually food insecure.
So, I mean, there's a lot of sweeping or very powerful ideas in the manifesto, right? You talked about universal healthcare, you've talked about education reform. We haven't gotten to touch on housing reform yet, right? And then, of course, famously, there is the reduction of GST. Right? What would you say to the PAP, or PAP supporters who might counter and say this is imprudent, right? This is dipping into our surplus, right? Yeah.
Well, to me, it doesn't make sense that you have a surplus. When a government runs a surplus, what that means is that they are collecting more from the taxpayers than they are giving to them. Having reserves is a different story. So this idea of a surplus, that the government has to maintain a huge surplus every year is illogical, because that means your taxes are too high. See, so basically you need to reduce the taxes, put more money into the pockets of the citizens so that they can start spending. And the share of our GDP that is domestic consumption is extraordinarily low. It's only about 40%. And even though we're a big trading hub and all that kind of thing, you still expect domestic consumption to be a much higher share of our GDP, but it isn't. And the reason is that domestic consumption is constrained by the low incomes, by the low wages, and that actually limits the spending power of the individual. And that also cripples the SMEs. The small and medium-sized enterprises depend on locals having money to spend, which is why the CDC vouchers, was the idea that you put vouchers in the hands of the people and then they can spend it on their local shops. But vouchers are temporary. If you raise their salary, they're also going to spend it on the local shops. If you give a tax cut to a billionaire, do you think he's going to spend his money on the local shop? No. Right? So the idea is, if you reduce the GST, you put more money in the pockets of the local individuals, the citizens, the people living in the so-called heartlands, then you're going to boost the local economy, because the local SMEs, the baker shop, or the hairdresser, or whoever it is who's located there is going to do well. And who are they going to spend their money on? They're going to spend their money on the renovation contractor, the painter, or whoever it is in the area. So the economy, the local economy starts to bubble up. And then you don't need to depend on these handouts that come every now and again.
Is this going to possibly make us less competitive to MNCs or to foreign investors coming in?
Well, I don't think so. But these foreign investors, they go on this so-called race to the bottom. You see, we've seen that. They move from China to Vietnam to Bangladesh. You see, and that's kind of a race to the bottom that we don't want to engage with. In fact, we have abandoned that race. People have written about deindustrialization of Singapore. But in a way, it's not a terribly bad thing, because the sweatshops that used to be there in the 1970s are gone, right? And now we're trying to move up the value chain, as they say. So sure, we may be less attractive than Bangladesh to somebody who wants to set up a sweatshop. But frankly, I don't think Singaporeans are interested in competing with Bangladesh for sweatshops.
Well, I think one other thing that Singaporeans are very interested in this election cycle is the issue of housing.
Right.
And the STP, of course, has proposed housing reform. So can you tell us a little bit about your housing plan?
Yeah, just this morning I was at a condo in Bukit Panjang, and we were talking about this. And obviously these people have a very high stake in the housing reform. Because what happens in the HDB market affects the condo market as well. And so our proposal is basically that you should give people a choice, whether they want a non-open market flat, which is basically the aim of public housing everywhere over the world, which is to put a roof over the head of the citizen, versus you want to have a tradable asset. And under the SDP plan, you have a choice. So your flat could either be a non-open market flat, which you can only sell to the HDB, and it will be priced at the construction cost. So the land cost would not be taken into account. Or it could be an open market flat, which could be priced at a premium, and then you can trade it. You can sell it on the resale market and so on. But you see, the issue is that the problem with including land costs in the price of an HDB flat is that the HDB owner does not have strata title. See, a condo owner has strata title. So essentially, if you get 80% or 90% of them, depending on how old the condo is, they can put the condo up on block for sale. And the developer can apply for a fresh lease. There are a lot of these 99-year condos out there. See, whereas in HDB, you can't. And there are many HDB flats that were built in the 1960s and 70s in McPherson, in Queenstown. And these flats are going to hit the magic number of 79 years. Because you know, when a flat has got 20 years left on its lease, you cannot use CPF to pay for it. So essentially, the price is going to come crashing down. So the Prime Minister then, in 2018, promised a voluntary early redevelopment scheme. But we have not heard anything about it. And that's a real concern. And in fact, this is one of the points that we're telling residents, that you have to send the PAP a strong message. Otherwise, they will get this, blank check or this mandate, and they'll say, okay, the people support whatever I want to do. And so I'm going to introduce this voluntary scheme that preserves the reserves and the surpluses and the land value, and too bad for you. You should have known better than to buy a flat in McPherson that's got 60, 70 years already gone on its lease. And I can well see the headlines, We have to preserve the well-being of the nation, the reserves for the future. These people are being selfish, and they should have known better than to buy these flats. But 50-year-old flats, 60-year-old flats are still going for close to $1 million. So it is a big concern, because Singaporeans need to really think about that.
So it sounds like you've got a very, very thorough, very comprehensive plan for public policy, right? But of course, the STP is also known, I think, for their insistence on democratic reform, right? So could you tell us a little bit more about that? What are some of the key areas that you'd like to see changed, right, in terms of democratic reform, in terms of civil liberties?
Well, one of the things that we feel is that Singapore's constitution actually does protect freedom of speech, freedom of expression, but there are so many qualifiers, and these need to be really looked at and re-examined. You may have heard that we have put in an appeal for the POFMA that we received about the activists who are carrying letters to the Istana. And I believe we've made our submissions to the court, so I can't say too much about it without being in contempt of court. But we've already said what our grounds of appeal are. That number one, that we were being accused of making a statement that we didn't really make. And number two is that Article 14 of the Constitution preserves the freedom of Singaporeans to freely express themselves. And this is something that we are going to fight tooth and nail to preserve. And we believe that in Singapore, there still is the rule of law. See, we took the first POFMA to the High Court, and we took it all the way to the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal gave a judgment. They were limited by the way Parliament had written the law, but at least they recognized the importance of the constitutional protection of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And Singapore hasn't quite gone down the road of the United States, where the president can defy a 9-0 ruling of the Supreme Court.
Yes.
And 40-something% of Americans still support him on that, which is
remarkable.
Just totally bizarre. 9-0. All the conservative judges voted against him, and he's just ignoring them. And this is the United States, which used to be the leader of the free world.
Yeah. Well, what about, let's say, changes to the EBRC? Of course, the SDP was hit really
bad.
Harsh.
I mean, and they're using it as a weapon against us now.
Absolutely, yeah.
But, it's quite clear. The first Election Boundaries Committee, as PJ, I think, has pointed out before, it was an all-party committee. Lee Kuan Yew was in the opposition, and he had a say in the way the boundaries were drawn up in the 1955 general election, as well as in the 1959 general election. And that didn't do any harm to Singapore. So I think there's plenty of place for open discussion, for maybe even getting public engagement, and being transparent about how you draw up the boundaries. You all know, right? There was one polling district with one person.
Oh yeah.
It's totally unbelievable. But these things happen, and that's what happens when you have a non-transparent system. You get these ridiculous events occurring.
So what's the SDP's relationship like with civil society or with activists?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, because there is a certain amount of tension. I think most of civil society recognizes that SDP is the most progressive and left-leaning of the parties, but we're still a political party.
Yes.
So we cannot put a certain particular cause front and center of our campaign, because we are appealing to voters across the spectrum. So we have to address the issues that are important to voters across the spectrum, but at the same time they know that we are the progressive party, that we are the party who, when push comes to shove, we're going to stand up and be counted. Okay, so I remember after the 2015 election, we were sitting in the office and a couple of activists came up and they gave us a earful, and they said, you guys, you let us down, you didn't do the, and he said, okay, yes we did. But our message has been, look, it's not like holding your nose, as what Kirsten said in her latest blog post, but it's recognizing that we need to get into Parliament, and then you hold us accountable, which is what Sundran has said the last time when we met the activists. We may not say right in front that the key point of our manifesto is protection of the environment and going dead set against fossil fuels, because that may make us a target, but it's right there. Climate change is in there, civil liberties are in there, respect for people are in there, and if and when we do get elected, like I said, you can hold us accountable to that.
Maybe could you tell us a little bit more about the STP's environmental plan? Because I think that's something that there is a sizable amount of, let's say, young people. Like I myself am fairly worried about the ecological crisis that we are facing. So could you tell us a little bit more about your
Well, that's actually the topic of my speach tonight.
Oh, great. Okay, so you all got a sneak preview there. Now you know what's coming up.
And in fact, I would be interested to hear what you think, because, obviously I'm an old guy. And so from my point of view, we finally switched to a hybrid. Our place where we live doesn't have a charging point. So, and anyway, most of Singapore's electricity comes from natural gas. So it doesn't make sense to really, it's not a big thing ecologically to switch to an electric car, at least in Singapore. But I was hoping to get some ideas from you about because basically our plan involves a transition to a non-carbon based economy. It involves taking actually leadership within the region to ensure that, because as you know, Singapore financing is still going into coal-fired nickel plants in Indonesia, and this is something that, with more information, that people will need to start backing off. And so it focuses on the big things. One thing that really irks a lot of people is the fact that this so-called personal carbon footprint, I'm sure was developed by BP's corporate comms people.
The greatest scams in history.
It's a total scam. And it's this personal responsibility thing. The idea that you give us tons of taxpayers' money to go polluting the environment, but you should watch out what you're doing about plastic straws, which is just crazy. Yeah.
All right. So last question before we head to the live questions and comments that we've received. Maybe what has been the most personally meaningful moment in your political career so far? If you had to really just pick one, maybe two.
Yeah, it's really hard because there's so many moments which have been really encouraging. But I think the one that really strikes home to me was just before the general election in 2020. And it was the last ward round I did before I took leave for 3 weeks, just like I did this time round. And one of my patients was there. She's this patient who has been in and out of hospital for the last 15 years. But she's got this complex genetic condition that she keeps getting recurrent infections and all kinds of things. And she said to me, I said to her, I've taken leave for the next 3 weeks, so I won't be able to come in and see you. And she said, that's okay. She said, you go and fight for us.
Oh.
And that was really touching, and that really sort of brought it home, is that, and it's been repeated with total strangers, with people I barely know, is the idea that they're looking for somebody who's willing to speak up for them. In fact, on my mum's obituary, we put that verse, which was actually right up there in the top of hers. Be a voice for the voiceless. So, and like I said, that's the one thing people know about the SDP, is that we're not going to be afraid to speak up.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
All right. Now, I know you're a very, very busy man. We want to
Sure.
not keep you for too long. Let's go look at some live questions.
Sure.
Right. So first one is coming in from Facebook by Aline.
Right.
And she says, I think that the COE is BS. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so COE is another example of a policy with good intentions, which is controlling the car population, which I think is a good thing, which has gone totally out of control. Because the original intention is gone. It's become a huge source of revenue for the government. And if they really wanted to control the car population, they could just ballot for cars every month. And make that available. And balloting is something which Singaporeans are so used to. We ballot for phase 3 places in primary school. We ballot for sale of balance flats. Way back 40 years ago, even before sale of ballot flats, the HDB had a similar mechanism, and I tried and failed.
All right, so Alan, that answers your question. Yes, it is BS.
Yes.
Right. Next one, also from Facebook, from Tubton Lim. Talk about... Next one coming in from Tina Cavallero, right? Also from Facebook. Any one party focusing on the CPF issue? Okay, I'm sure you've got a lot to talk about this, but she goes on and says they are trying to reverse the 2% GST increase. What about releasing that minimum sum held in ransom for all those who have reached 55 years old? And can we reverse that back to the original promise of full withdrawal when one reaches 55?
Absolutely.
Okay,
in fact,
that's
that is
great.
right there on our platform. And last night, I can't remember who it was who said that. That we have called right from the beginning that CPF was a promise. I think it was Dr. Cho Chin Chai who mentioned that. It was a promise to have the CPF returned to us at 55. And you have the option, this is in our cost of living paper, our economic paper, that some people will want to keep it in the CPF because the 2.5% interest is pretty safe and it's pretty decent.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, people who invest their CPF money, they tend to lose money. And the majority of them actually can't make the equivalent of 2.5%.
Yes.
So if you want to keep it at the 2.5% interest, which is the legislatively mandated minimum CPF interest, then that's fair enough, it's up to you. But on the other hand, there are a lot of other people who want to do other things with the money. They want to make a long-awaited pilgrimage or holiday, or they want to do something like that.
Yeah.
And there's no reason why they should be denied the right to take out their own money. So we've long argued that the money should be released at 55.
But what about the government's, I suppose, retort, right? That people can't really be trusted with it. What happens if they bankrupt themselves, and then we will have to foot the bill for getting them back on their feet?
Yeah, but the government doesn't. And that's the reality. And this is, it's again not the Singapore government's fault. This is a right-wing trope that dates all the way back to Ronald Reagan. When he tried to cut welfare, he made up this story about this welfare mother who was living on welfare and driving a Cadillac. It turned out she didn't exist. In the Singapore equivalent is the uncle who goes to Batam and spends all his CPF money. It doesn't exist because most of these uncles who go to Batam don't have any money in their CPF because they were odd job workers in the first place. So they were casual laborers. They never got a chance to build up a CPF. So they had nothing to spend in what they spend in Batam is what they've conned somebody into giving them.
All right, so there you have it, Tina. Yes, CPF reform and full withdrawal when one reaches 55. All right.
Yes.
So next up, we have a question also from Facebook. Wow, Facebook seems to be popping off today. From Eggle Waffles. MediShield premiums keep increasing non-stop. We have to dump 100k into a black hole that we cannot withdraw ever. Yeah. What about MediShield premiums?
Yeah, so just to clarify a little bit. So MediShield is not for you to withdraw. That's MediSafe, which is for you to withdraw. MediShield, on the other hand, is a risk pooling. It's a kind of insurance. And MediShield actually has a very low loss ratio. So in other words, the amount that MediShield Life actually, which is what it is, the amount that MediShield Life takes in versus the amount that it pays out, there's a huge difference. Under Obamacare, insurance companies should pay out about 80 to 90% of what they take in. MediShield Life is closer to 50 or 60%. And their rationale is because they have to have these huge provisions. And these huge provisions are in case there's a major pandemic and half of the people are wiped out or need long-term care forever, I see. And this, unfortunately, is typical of the so-called kiasu mentality of the Singapore government. See? So because there is this possibility of this, they are keeping and keeping and keeping more and more of the money, and they're raising the premiums. You see, the stated reason is because they're projecting for future costs. But if you project for future costs, then you shouldn't raise premiums on existing policyholders.
Yeah.
You should raise premiums on the new policyholders and use the projections to top up the projection for extra additional costs when the population ages. It's just like I've told the story before. I bought an insurance policy when I was 29 years old, so it was locked in at that rate. I'm still paying the same rate even 40 years later. The benefits, of course, are not that great, but they're still there.
Yep.
And that's why young people should buy insurance, because you lock in the rate at a low level. But for this rate to go up, and MediShield Life, in a very unusual state for a state-mandated health insurance, actually has higher premiums for older people, which is very odd, see, because in a state-mandated premium, you should ideally have a standard rate.
Yeah.
Commercial policy, sure, you can have a high premium for older person, and that's the motivation for a young person.
Yeah.
You get in when you're young, and then you lock in the premium, and it should be locked in. You see, whereas MediShield Life is not.
All right. So you're going to love this next question. This is from YouTube. Nadasan asks, how to be a volunteer with your party? Yes.
Right.
So how? Give us a step-by-step.
So you just go to our website. There's a volunteer button. In our social media, there's a QR code that's available. And right now we're looking for polling agents.
Oh.
Yeah, we're really short of polling agents. In the small SMC of Bukit Panjang, there are 88 polling stations. And we generally have 2 shifts. So you work on the morning shift from say 8 a.m. to about 2 p.m. or you work on the evening shift from 2 p.m. till 8 p.m. We provide you with lunch. That's about all. Okay, but you get a chance to see democracy in action. And the job of a polling agent is really, really important. Because how voting in Singapore takes place. You go to the polling station, you bring your polling card, you bring your IC, they shout out your name and your serial number. And the guy from the PAP will be staring at you. And this guy is not some stranger. He's actually the guy who is from your neighborhood committee or your RC who's handing out the CDC vouchers. So you get really intimidated unless you see a smiling face from the SDP sitting right next to him. See, he tells you, your vote is secret. Don't be intimidated. And this person who is there as a polling agent can also keep an eye on things that are going on. Yes. One of the things that we are concerned about is the vast majority of the civil servants running the elections are very good. They're very fair. Okay, but sometimes when you have elderly people coming along, they have persistently refused to allow family members or caregivers to go along with them. So I've often felt that they should mic up the election official so that you can hear what they're telling the elderly person. Because very often the elderly person will say, what should I do? And they're a little bit confused some of the time. Yeah. So it's important for the family members to remember to instruct the elderly person, find out what they want and tell them what to do. And the polling agent is there to kind of make sure that everything, like I said, 99.9% of the time it goes fine. But I think part of that is because we have polling agents from all the different parties who are there.
Fully agreed. All right, next up we have a question here from Chaos Burger. You're going to love this. Okay. How can this guy not be in Parliament? You want to say
don't ask me. There are 2,500 people more in Bukit Panjang who I have to convince.
Well, we're quite close. We're quite close to that number. All right. Next one by Howard Chua from Facebook. It says, the SDP has called for GST to be removed for some essential items. I feel like this is a good idea. Today we have GST absorbed for subsidized patients in restructured hospitals. These can be extended to essential things like school fees, student care, town councils, etc.
Yeah, I think that's true. Although, I think administratively it would be easier if you just had a blanket exemption for these items. The logistics are something that we can work out. But I think as long as in principle you accept that, and most of the political parties, the alternative political parties do. And in fact, there is already a GST exemption if the vendor is a turnover of less than $1 million.
All right, so here's actually a very interesting question by Chandra Das from YouTube. Would you be open to working with the WPA to ensure a stronger and more incisive discussion on policy?
Oh, definitely. I mean, they already have put out their manifesto. It's got an incredible number of points. And there are many points which are very similar to what we have in our manifesto, but there are certain small differences. So we'd definitely be happy to work with them.
So we've got another comment here from Chaos Burger again on YouTube, right? What are your views on the GST reversion as proposed by the SDP? And would it work given that prices have already gone up and continue to go up?
Yeah. So, they always say that once things go up, they can't go down. And that's possibly true, but I think there'll be a lot of pressure on the vendors. And what it would take is for some leadership from one of the major chains. Like, for example, if NTUC FairPrice said, okay, GST has been cut from 9% to 2%, so we're going to cut the price of everything by 10%. Yeah. And that would send a signal. Because if NTUC FairPrice did that, then Sheng Siang would follow, then Giant would follow, and cold storage would also follow. Otherwise, they'd lose market share. See, so I think in general, it's going to take some leadership, some arm twisting. And if in fact the PAP decides to do it, they'll claim it as their own idea, and they'll make NTUC FairPrice do it.
Okay, so we've got here another question, the last question actually by Tupton Lim from Facebook. And he says, do tell us about the non-open market scheme of the SDP and explain how it's a great solution for our public housing.
Yeah, hi Tupton, good to hear from you. I know him.
Oh, so you know this guy? Okay.
Yeah, I do.
All right.
I haven't heard from him for a long time.
Okay.
So anyway, basically the non-open market scheme means that these flats are going to be like the HDB flats were from 1968 to 1987. So they are priced at the cost of construction, and they can only be sold back to the HDB. So you cannot expect to turn a profit from them. And they'll be sold back to HDB at a price that's dependent on the amount of the lease that has been consumed. So essentially, conceptually, they fit in with the idea of public housing as a roof over the heads of citizens. So they are not meant to be tradable. And you can convert a non-open market flat to an open market flat by paying the premium difference. And then if you decide that you want to trade it, you want to emigrate to Australia and sell off your flat, then you can obviously pay the premium and then put it on the market and see what happens.
Okay. All right. So that's all of the questions, and I don't want to keep you any longer.
Thank you.
Right. It's been a very, very wonderful, enlightening conversation.
Thank you.
I know you're on a very busy campaign trail.
Yes.
Right? So for everybody tuning in at home, whether it's on YouTube or Instagram or Facebook, whatever, right? Thank you so much for joining us. Please do remember to like, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned because we're going to be doing more interviews and more talk shows like this in the coming days. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Dr. Tam, for being here. Wonderful talking to you. And we'll see you again next time.
A lot of people still don't know how Singapore's parliament actually works. So here's a quick explainer, especially with the general election coming up. Singapore uses a first-past-the-post system. That means in each constituency, the party or team with the most votes wins, even if it's just by one vote. After the election, the party with the most elected MPs gets to form the government. To control parliament, they need a simple majority. That's at least 49 out of 97 seats. Once they have that, they choose the Prime Minister and form the cabinet. A simple majority equals more than half the seats. That's 49 seats in the new 97-seat parliament. But a two-thirds supermajority is 65 seats. Why is that important? Because certain laws, especially changes to the constitution, need at least two-thirds of MPs to agree. If one party holds 65 or more seats, they can amend the constitution without needing support from other parties. Laws start as bills, which are proposed and debated in Parliament. If a majority of MPs vote yes, the bill becomes law. But again, if it's a constitutional change, it needs at least 65 MPs to agree, not just 49. So your vote doesn't just decide who gets in, it also affects how much power one party has. Now you know the difference between 49 and 65 seats and why it matters. Understanding how government is formed and how parliament works helps you see why every seat matters.